Hello, everybody, and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host, Cora. Thank you so very, very much for joining me. It is wonderful to see you, as always. Thanks so much for hopping on in here. Let's talk about gender diversity some more. And this week, much like we do every time we come together, we take a confidently declared statement from a politician or sometimes a famous book author, sometimes an international tech mogul, as we do this week, and we take their confidently declared statements for the questions we're sure they're intended to be. Because of course they're intended to be questions pretty confidently declared, but they're questions, right? And we take their questions for the questions that we hope they're intended to be, and we see if we can't find an answer to them together by reviewing the scientific literature, or in this case, as part of our new video series. Wonderful to see you all. Anybody at home, visually you can see me. It's like a whole technical revolution over here. It's wonderful to see you. We're going to be interviewing experts in the field to answer questions represented by these rather confidently declared statements. And this week, our very confidently declared statement comes from international tech mogul and extremely wealthy and influential man, Elon Musk. Now, we're going to hear from Elon Musk in his interview recently with Jordan Peterson, just a little excerpt as we always do. But even in that little excerpt, Elon Musk is going to talk in rather emotive terms. He's also going to misgender his transgender daughter. Forgive me in advance for that. I can't find a clip where he doesn't do that. And also in here, he's going to speak about some pretty challenging stuff when it comes to being the parent of a trans kid. So we are going to hear from him. Please, when we are hearing from him, it's only about a minute long. Please look after yourself when you're listening to him, and know that we are going to take this question for the question we know it is intended to be. We're going to tackle it together. So here is Elon Musk.
I lost my son, essentially. They call it dead naming for a reason.
Yeah,
All right. So the reason it's called dead naming is because your son is dead. So my son Xavier is dead, killed by the woke mind virus.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
I can't imagine what that would be like.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, and there's lots of people in that situation now.
Right.
It's not pretty, and lots of demolished kids.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's a good reason to be the final straw. All right, so let's.
So I vowed to destroy the woke mind virus after that.
He vowed to destroy the woke mind virus after that. Vowed to destroy the woke mind virus. Pretty bold statement, but hey, we'll take it for the question we're sure is intended to be. It's a question, right? It's got to be a question. And we're going to try to answer it. Now, sure, it's pretty tricky to answer the question about the woke mind virus killing Elon Musk's son, in inverted commas. Like, that's a pretty tricky question to answer. But the question, I think, that's represented by this rather bold series of statements is, how do we create a context in which everybody can have these kind of conversations? How, in the context of talking about gender diversity as a virus that you can be infected by, one assumes, a mind virus that can also kill you, sure, how do we at all find common ground in this social context where such bold and such incredibly challenging statements are made? How do we ever come together to reach any kind of consensus and work together to create a world where everybody can find a place to belong? And that's the question we're going to answer today. Now, of course, if you're interested in learning more about the question of whether gender diversity is socially caught from other people in a kind of social contagion, which I think is what the woke mind virus concept is sort of harking to, then you can hear Classroom Psychology. We absolutely cover the question of social contagion. And short answer is no, social contagion doesn't really hold up as a theory in the literature. You can't really catch gender diversity from other people. It's not a virus. And it can't kill you. It's simply a state of being that, as we have found from, legends like Dr. Jack Turpin's work, we find that gender diversity is simply a truth of human experience and human diversity, and it is something that people often realize when they're children or when they're adolescents. And, it's simply a part of human diversity. It's not something that we should be afraid of. In fact, the fact that Elon Musk's daughter has been able to come out and live as her authentic self is something we could celebrate rather than fear. But of course, there is a level of grief that comes with transition, right? So some of Elon Musk's point kind of, the emotion at least does kind of make sense, that you might grieve the child or partner that you have lost. You might even grieve as the trans person, the life that you thought you might have, that transition has changed. And you might also grieve the life that wasn't before you transitioned. I, for sure, have grieved that myself. So there is grief, and so there is common ground here, even in the context of this such severe and stark statement. I think we can find common ground. And if we can find common ground, then maybe we can generate consensus and actually find a way that we can all, even if we can't understand each other, we can respect each other, the decisions that we make, and the people that we are on the inside. But the question for us now is, how do we do that? Given the contentiousness of this field, how do we find consensus when we disagree so heavily? Well, thankfully, we have the legendary Dr. Antreas Anthimou, educational psychologist and academic here at the University of Southampton, where he conducted his doctoral thesis project on the topic of gender diversity, and specifically about how you create consensus in the most challenging contexts, the post-colonial context of Cyprus, modern Cyprus, where gender diversity, across the world, gender diversity is pretty controversially viewed basically everywhere. But in that most controversial of contexts, the most challenging circumstances, how do we create consensus socially? Well, thank goodness we have Antreas to talk to. So here is the legendary Dr. Antreas Anthimou. So I guess I wondered, would you mind talking to us a little bit about your work, and what does it teach us about what gender is?
Oh, it's a very packed topic, and to be fairly honest, when I engaged with this topic almost 2.5 years ago, when we started kind of exploring ideas in different directions, it's a topic that I've never dealt with before, only on a personal level, like what you see and what you experience outside in the world. So to see that this was kind of a hot topic of political discussions in the UK, kind of made me feel a little bit jittery as I was expanding this project and discussing with you, because I just felt that, hey, I'm coming to this from a very I was motivated from a personal cause. I also wanted to see the research side of it, and then to see that there was this full-blown debate going on, and different political agendas, and what happened with the suspension of the gender identity clinic and all that kind of stuff. It did make me feel a little bit, right, I think I need to, even more so now, I need to tread very carefully when touching these topics. But to be very honest,
that's fascinating. Yeah, it's fascinating that you coming to this topic fairly fresh. You could feel the sensitivity of it just from just the prospect of potentially doing work in this field. You could see how difficult that might be.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
How did you manage that? How did you because you did this amazing work. What made you step over the boundary that you saw?
I think it was the fact that I was surrounded by people that do not take things at face value. So throughout the project, they challenged me, and we engaged in many insightful conversations, debates, arguments, and they were all underpinned by respect. So there was no, like, people were not defensive. There was not any bashing or aggression. It was genuinely curiosity as to why did you choose to do this thing, to explore the topic of how do we talk about gender, because that's essentially what I explored. How did discussion of gender take place? What is the language used when we talk about gender? So having people around me, both professionals like supervisors and friends and family, challenging me in a gentle way, it was, I think, what I needed to stay and kind of like persevere through the noise that surrounds this field.
Right. It's so fascinating that your work is about, by the sounds of things, like about the language we use to have the conversation about gender, and you could see like just the language being used as you approached the topic was so like problematic, and yet we're able to kind of step over that into asking people about, you know, how do we find language that works, that is more inclusive? How do we think about gender in a more inclusive way? That's fascinating to me. So I mean, so like, what about our language that we use to describe gender then was insufficient, given like what you have been thinking about?
Well, coming very fresh, as you said, in this kind of topic, and not being familiar with most of the terms or the current slang that is being used even around gender, I didn't come thinking there is a shortcoming in the language we use, because honestly, I didn't have a solid opinion on the matter. My opinion was being formed as I was exploring this.
Right.
But conversing with individuals that do experience this firsthand, I was getting the idea that perhaps this quest for labels and terminology that is all-encompassing and inclusive and all that kind of stuff, perhaps this quest is flawed from the beginning, because it creates gaps. It constantly tries to bridge gaps. So it got me thinking, what can we do so there are no gaps from the first place? And that's how we managed to together to go a step back and use the methodology we used, like the Delphi methodology, to like, hey, we're not here to identify which labels make sense to you. We're here to ask you, how do you make sense of the discussion around gender? Does it make sense to you to use these labels? Do you prefer to not discuss this kind of things? So that's kind of like the whole idea where it was lying to. It wasn't to just pinpoint on the, 50 out of 100 people chose this label and so on and so forth. It was just, what happens if you give people a platform to explore their own perceptions of gender and see what happens.
That's so amazing. Just so giving people just a platform to explore gender through language, essentially, and pondering what is the outcome of that. So what happens when you put people in a position to give them that platform? What happens?
Interestingly, and just to put everything in a little bit of the context, the methodology essentially and gathered a panel of people that signed up for the project. Those people, those individuals were essentially invited. To be honest, it was one basic criterion. If you're interested in these kind of discussions, if you experience it firsthand, or if you know others that experience this maybe discomfort from that binary essentialist point of view of gender, come, I want to hear your opinions. And through this project, essentially, we just dumped like 114 statements of them that there were gender-related statements that came from the literature. It came from young people in the UK. Some were generated from the adult panelists in Cyprus, and the platform that I'm referring to essentially is giving them those statements. And over the course of from August 2023 to January 2024, these people were coming back again and again and again, rating again those statements, influencing one another, trying to agree on what makes sense, linguistically speaking, to discuss gender. And essentially what happened, I personally believe there was conflict. Perhaps there was even change of opinions. Some people polarized on their views the more time was passing. So there was a lot of social psychology going on there as well, because people could see each other's answers, but everything was anonymous. You could see where the group opinion lied and where your opinion was, so you had the chance to change or stay the same. And I think it was a good way to mirror the reality of things, where people discuss, debate, and disagree or agree on discussions of gender. However, because this happened in a safe, controlled, and anonymous space, the idea that stood out was respect. So even when people could not agree on pronouns or understanding of experiences outside of the binary, then the panelists started creating their own statements to represent them, and those statements basically stepped on the idea of, I don't really need to understand this, I just need to be respectful and just keep my open and listen to your experience.
Wow. Okay. There's so much to think about there. So a really fascinating methodology to bring people together who you mentioned had a discomfort with the binary mod. So they had, I guess, a sense similar to what you had, that there might be a sort of like a gap between this kind of, there's just men and women in the world and people's experience. Is that safe to say?
Yes, I presume so. There were adults between the ages of 20 to 29 years old, all identified as cisgender, which is something that got us thinking as to how other more diverse gender diverse communities maybe did not feel safe to approach this matter, because this was conducted back in Cyprus, and these communities are still emerging. But yeah.
Wow. So that is in and of itself fascinating. So we have a group of young people essentially in their 20s talking about gender, having a sense that the binary isn't necessarily they feel a bit of discomfort, I think you said, with the gender binary, and yet in asking for young people, we couldn't find gender diverse young people, and your sense is because they felt a bit maybe they wouldn't be welcome, or maybe a bit sensitive about coming forward.
Yeah, but that is my assumption based on the whole the recruiting process, because I went out everywhere and anywhere, universities, colleges, schools. I did not approach because we're over the age of 18, so that's the sample we went for, and because it's quite a controversial topic, culturally speaking. So to approach teenagers and children discussing these kind of matters would have required different sorts of ethics clearance.
Right.
So yeah, from the recruitment process, seeing how tricky it was to access these more gender diverse communities, and I think you remember we had to get very creative with the recruiting, even in clubs or in online spaces, and even when we approached, I think what was the drop that made everything spill was when one of the leading organizations in the country that supports this kind of communities declined to support the project and promote to the members. When they did that, they explained that it was not out of lack of interest, but they have to shield their members essentially, and they don't have the knowledge or the resources to evaluate a project to understand if it is indeed to the best interest of these kind of individuals. So they wished me best of luck, and they said that they couldn't officially endorse any sort of research project. So that was kind of like the drop that made everything spill, thinking, okay, I'm navigating perhaps very dark and mysterious fields here.
So here, like, so the Cypriot context, you mentioned briefly that some of the language is still emerging. Do you mind me asking about like the history of Cyprus? Like, how has the language evolved over time?
Starting for the most recent history, I mean, it's a fairly newly established republic. Back in the 60s, it used to be a British colony up until 1960, when it gained its independence. So, linguistically speaking, the island essentially had two official languages. That was Greek and Turkish. But there was also a heavy influence from the British, being a colony. Before that, it was part of the Ottoman Empire. Before that, it was the French, the Italians. So there is, at least from the southern part where I am from, the Greek Cypriot part, language is heavily based on the Greek language, but we have a dedicated dialect, the Cypriot dialect, which incorporates elements of Turkish, French, English, and everything really, even a little bit of Arabic in some parts.
Wow.
But in designing this project and in translating the statements that were going to be given to the participants, we used the Greek language because that's what is being taught officially in schools in the southern part, in the Greek speaking part of the Republic of Cyprus, essentially. And it was really difficult to make that translation of the English statement on gender in the Greek language, because a lot of the things, at first I thought it was my ignorance. I haven't used any of these terms in Greek. I've only learned and used them in English. So I brought on board other professionals, bilingual and multilingual professionals from Cyprus that live abroad as well, to help me with this translation process. And we still struggled quite a lot to translate terms, especially the ones that had to do with pronouns. Because the they, them is in Greek, it kind of like reflects the it, and it's usually used for inanimate objects or animals. So you won't find it in these gender diverse communities. It might, at least from what I found, you won't find it that often. Some people do use the it in Greek, which is the representative of they, them, but there's no widely accepted gender neutral pronoun. So this is kind of like the landscape in Cyprus. These conversations are still quite premature. I mean, it was even after Cyprus stopped being a British colony and gained its independence, it was only 38 years later that they overturned laws around the criminalization of homosexuality, for example, that they adopted from Britain as a colonizer. And that came with a lot of push and support from the European Union, because Cyprus then became part of the European Union about 6 years later. So in order to follow these international obligations and be part of Europe, which the Cypriot government wanted, they had to show evidence of understanding and tolerance to different communities. But here we are, 26 years later from the decriminalization of homosexuality in Cyprus. And only 2 years ago, there was a bill proposed for Cypriots to have the right to legally change and identify their right to legally change their gender identity. So the bill was proposed 2 years ago. It's still a pending bill. Yes, I mean, I'm trying not to say anything that is outside of my remit, like politically speaking. I don't know where that is, what stage it is, but I know it hasn't gone through yet.
Amazing. Yeah. Yeah. Super interesting. Super interesting. The British colonial context. So back to your research then. In that context, finding that gender diverse people was still at this point sort of there's a lot of caution about letting gender diverse people come forward, and they themselves were not like super comfortable coming forward clearly. And yet managing to get together a group of people who were in their 20s who had a sense of the gender binary being like over limiting in people's experience. And they came together, and you mentioned that they were focused then on respect, that there was a sort of, it sounds like dissonance in the way that people thought about gender in more diverse ways. Can you tell us a bit more about the dissonance? What was it like? Were people like finding it hard to agree?
Yeah, like the idea that gender is exclusively male or female was rejected by 55.3% of the participants.
Wow.
So that I interpreted as opinion remaining kind of split. What happens with the rest of 45%? So I have to think like, oh, these findings, I think, especially you see them in isolation, are easy to misinterpret as conservative. But despite that 55% of the panelists rejected the binary, they also endorsed the idea that being non-binary meant living with gender absent of male and female role. And that was a 68% consensus, like they endorsed the idea. So I kind of like, it got me thinking, like, do I have, on one hand, I was thinking, do I have imposters in this study trying to push conservative agendas? Because that wasn't the purpose. But hey, I mean, I asked for people who are interested in this topic, and feeling discomfort with this topic and being aware that these communities exist doesn't really mean that you empathize with them. But in terms of what kind of participants I recruited, I think I got what I asked for: people who feel discomfort. Now, if that discomfort is in support of these communities or not, that's down to each individual panelist in this study. But it really got me thinking as to why somebody who has been rating these kind of statements very conservatively, I mean, even using the word conservatively, I think is not fair. It's a person's opinion. So a person feels throughout, from August to January, that I was asking them to rate this statement, exclusively male or female, there is a reason that they kept choosing, that's definitely important. This is definitely only male and female. So why does a participant like that spend their time rating 114 statements, going through questionnaires that last more than 20 minutes each round to rate these statements? So spending their time from August to January remaining in this study just to say his opinion, and then checking their other opinions, seeing that that participant essentially, they were one of the people that introduced the idea of, maybe I don't need to understand this, I just need to listen more and accept this. So I think that was fascinating how, like, what kept you in this study? Like, I'm not here to change any government bill. I'm not here, I don't have the power to do that in any way. I'm here giving people, co-producing ideas with people. So I just found it fascinating as to why that person and several other panelists felt strongly motivated to see this through and share these ideas and possibly deal with the internal and external conflicts in that panel that we're discussing these ideas.
It kind of sounds kind of optimistic. Like there's a the underlying drive of people was to, like, they wanted social connection and cohesion, even though they disagreed on the gender stuff. They wanted, like, they agreed that we can all respect each other regardless.
If people, I don't know, there's something there. I'm gonna find it. I'm still learning from this project, to be honest, even after I've submitted and finished it. But it just makes me think that if people that disagree like this is such a micro level kind of like observation, but if in this controlled environment, people that disagree are able to sit through this very rigorous and tiring process of online debating, essentially, and be respectful to one another and influence, as evidenced by the statistics that I produced, influence one another in their opinions. So if that can happen in that micro level, how can we then transfer that in this jungle of politics that is happening now in the UK and possibly in many other places in the world? How can these conversations take place between people that both recognize the existence of these topics and communities, but disagree on the level of empathy that these communities deserve? How can we transfer that?
Yes, that sounds like an incredibly important piece of work. If we could master that, even though people disagree, they treat each other with a great deal of respect. I feel like that would be a meaningful thing to do.
Indeed. How can we help people see that it's not a zero-sum relationship? Because it's all like love and butterflies when you talk about respect and understanding and inclusivity and all that kind of stuff. But truth is, when these kind of discussions enter the public domain in important sectors like education, health, and care, that's when things start becoming competitive, and
Yes.
that's when I feel that it starts becoming a zero-sum relationship. So me recognizing you, I feel that I'm going to lose something. So why do people feel that they're going to lose something?
Yeah, it feels like a really important point that you mentioned that people might feel like they lose something. What is this, like, all of your work tell us about what gender is in people's minds? Like, what are the kind of ways of thinking about gender that were revealed here?
I think this was an after effect of the project, because I did have people approaching me afterwards on an informal level, commenting on this work, and it was really interesting because it really sparked some very interesting debates. People wanted to be inherently kind to one another, and talking about a country as well, like Cyprus, where again the influence of Christianity and like love thy neighbor and all the kind of stuff that have been embedded in the moral values of that culture. So people wanted to be kind to one another, but again, that raised very well the question of why do we feel that we're giving up something when we give space to gender diverse communities? And it was one participant particularly that highlighted essentially how can we solve gender inequality issues if gender is not perceived as binary anymore? Or another participant shared that, like, what does motherhood and fatherhood look like outside of the binary? I wouldn't know how to approach that as a teacher. I wouldn't know how to support a child that experiences that different type of fatherhood or motherhood, or a different family that deviates from what is culturally accepted in Cyprus, like that heteronormative core family with mom and dad and so on. So it's kind of like the all boils down on the idea that these topics should not be taken lightly, at least not as lightly as you see them on like, can I name platforms? Online platforms, or how these things trend. Like, you have these topics trending and different influencers promoting these kind of matters, each with their own way. So sometimes people felt, from what I got from these discussions, that they're just being spoon-fed online agendas on gender diversity and LGBTQI plus communities and the whole woke movement. And for some, this has become quite tiring. So it's an almost automatic reaction that they get every time they come across this kind of things. It's like, oh, here they are again. all flashy in our faces. Like, we decriminalized homosexuality. What else do they want? Like this kind of thing.
Right.
So it was interesting through those informal chats after the study to see how people essentially felt that they lacked the means to show
right.
honest efforts in understanding these kind of communities, because all they're being fed, all the information that they're being fed is kind of like passively given to them by what they see out there, the media, the politics. So it's almost as if there is a lack of active effort to engage and learn from these communities, unless you have a family member or you yourself are part of this community. I'm not sure if I'm making sense. Maybe I was on a tangent.
I think you are. I think it sounds like what you are saying is that our sort of mainstream methods of introducing people to like modern linguistic approaches to gender or ways of thinking about gender is always kind of contentious. Like the approach to teaching people is always like sensationalized, or it's extreme, or it's like highlighting prejudice, or it's in its approach causes people to feel defensive rather than to feel what your approach encouraged them to feel, which was collaborative by the sounds of things, like respectful.
That collaborative approach. And I think that's what this project brought. It was this collaborative approach that kind of like gave that layer of protection and safety to exchange this idea. Because other than that, I mean, many of the participants, the panelists in this study, did say that the statements that they were presented with were very cognitively challenging and linguistically heavy. And that's true. Those statements came from a systematic literature review and a meta-ethnography that Dr. Jamie Wilson did 2 years prior. So they're not necessarily written in spoken language. So you needed to kind of like use 110% of your brain to put the sentences together, because it used kind of like elaborate terms on describing gender, because we threw everything at them, all the kind of terminology that there is out there, so they could filter it out the way they wanted. And the feedback was that this is cognitively challenging. Through this project, these people were being exposed to a more nuanced side of this movement or LGBTQI plus experience. And for many of these participants, the kind of exposure they had to these kind of communities, it's only when these communities are at their loudest and more clearest and flashiest moments. So the pride, or whenever there is kind of like not a protest, how do you call that? But yeah, when people gather together to do something, to raise awareness. So it's interesting when your opinion on this community is only formed when you see them at their flashiest and loudest.
Yes.
I mean, I saw that people tended to complain and say, why do you need to be so flashy and loud? But then getting the chance to participate in this project and seeing this other side, this very detailed and nuanced side of describing these experiences, that's when people started to, like in round 2 and round 3, started to change a little bit their opinions and highlighting tolerance and understanding and respect as core values that are important in this kind of conversations.
Fascinating. So it sounds like it teaches us a little bit about, I mean, how to change minds is both about the flashy. Sure, we need some of the flashy, but we also need to have these kind of nuanced conversations where people can find common ground, which I guess is what your methodology was all about, right? Finding common ground.
Indeed. I mean, I'm going to be fairly honest with you, Cora. I really struggled with this project because again, very new to this kind of field. And it's something that it's also slightly outside of my reality as well, personally. I mean, I do have people close to me that are part of this community, but personally, I felt that I've watched from the outside for my whole life. So I did feel as an imposter as well while exploring this topic. And even more so when it was time to link this project to the field of educational psychology, because that's what we are. We want this to make some practical sense in our work as psychologists. I started struggling because my mind went everywhere and anywhere when exploring this topic. I got lost in it. So, and I think this is a discussion we had already when the university sent me to present this at a conference, at an international conference. I kept seeing poster presentations from other researchers having a very clear and succinct what now section. This is my findings. I've developed this scale to use with children. I've developed this assessment tool. And in my what now section, I had more questions than answers on the topic of gender. So I felt that what did I actually bring with this project if it's only questions? So I did feel a little bit self-conscious as a researcher there in that international conference, representing gender diverse experiences. And, I was standing there with my little poster and it had a little pride flag on it, and I was wearing my pride socks and everything. And I just kept doubting myself as to what is the actual value of running this project for more than 2 years and creating more questions than answers, because we needed practical implications for the field. But I think all that changed towards the end of that poster presentation session when random people started approaching me in a very gentle manner, just reading the poster, asking me questions on the topic, and then out of nowhere just starting to unload their personal experiences on me. So their coming out experience, their experiences as gay immigrants from countries that are not maybe considered so tolerant on these kind of matters. And in that moment, I started thinking that perhaps that's my so what. The so what is, if you show that you're open to discussing these kind of things in a respectful manner, people come to you and they feel safe to share their experience. And I think that was kind of like the key takeaway from this research.
That's beautiful. It's beautiful because I love the idea that, in one sense, there was no easy solution to what's quite an enduring and challenging problem. And then in another, there was just making space and being there and giving space for people to come forward and feeling safe to do so. And they did. Got cows in the background.
Brilliant.
So in one sense, people feeling like they, I love that idea that actually the recommendation from the work is beautifully broad in that sense. Like, it's actually the things that we need to do might be as big as they can be, but fundamentally they're shared with what's shared by all these kind of things that we can do is this idea that we're just making space. So if I can ask you then, what is this in terms of making space linguistically? What does this all tell us about ways of thinking about gender? What if we were to sort of present to young people today and say, hey, we have this way of thinking about gender that makes space for all of the variations that you might experience. Do you have a sense of what that might include, like broadly? What kind of concepts might we need to talk about if we're talking about gender in a broad sense?
Actually, I do have an idea bouncing off of the current project. So you get people to rate statements. Statements are language, words. You're limited by translations. You're limited by the different kind of linguistic and cultural nuances that exist in each statement. So what if the same way that my poster attracted possibly people because I had certain symbols on it, or a pride flag, or some gender-related symbols. What if there was some way that we could explore people's non-verbal understanding of gender through the presentation and rating of such symbols that exist outside in like mainstream media, such as the pride flag? If you take it in isolation, like the asexual flag, the trans flag, like separate all those kind of things, the gender symbols, even in bathroom figures, all those kind of stuff. I think it will be very interesting to see what's the non-verbal understanding and what kind of cognitive schema people create through the interaction with these kind of symbols. What kind of feelings come out when you see these kind of symbols? Was the fact that you saw my recruitment poster having a rainbow flag on it, was that something that deterred you from approaching this project because this is something that you keep seeing in the media and you feel that you're saturated with this kind of woke agenda? So I think that non-verbal understanding of gender is kind of important to see.
That's fascinating. So is it like the way of thinking about gender might be symbolic in a fundamental way? Like we might best think about how people conceive of gender through symbols rather than through language on its own?
Yes. I mean, what kind of emojis do girls, boys, non-binary, or anything on the big spectrum, what kind of emojis do they use when they text or chat? Is there any reason behind that? Is there a symbolic gender representation between those symbols and emojis, for example? Because emoji is also a mode of expression. So yeah, but to bring it back to the linguistic side of it, I think at the very least, since the government is so interested in these kind of discussions and they really want to do something about it, I suppose the evidence base they're looking for is going to be in the spaces in the safe and controlled spaces they create for these people to share their experiences. Because I'm not sure what kind of you could say that a paper on people talking might not be the evidence base that the government is looking for to support or not support gender affirmative care. But what does exactly the evidence base look like to them? That's my question, actually. If I want to learn about these people's experiences are gonna come from their words. So unless there is some other method to really quantify it in a reliable and valid way, then I'm out of ideas, to be honest, as to what exactly they're looking for in the guidance they're trying to give to professionals like us when it comes to gender affirmative care.
Fascinating. That's fascinating. So as we kind of run to the end, I wanted to ask a question. If you were to have a message, like this is quite possibly going to be watched by quite a bunch of like gender diverse young people, colleagues, but to the gender diverse and LGBTQIA2 plus youth out there, if we would have a message to them that we could round off with, what might that message be? What would you say to them?
As lonely as it sounds, you're the only person that understands your own experience. And whether you want to advocate for that experience or not, that's your absolute right. But know this, that you're definitely not alone out there. As cliche as this may sound. Because if myself as a person who, again, I feel quite as an imposter in these kind of topics, if I can feel, I have very strong feelings about this topic right now and these communities, and if I can reach this point in such short time of 2 years, and this understanding and this kind of strong motivation to learn more and support, I can't imagine what a person that actually lives this experience can do.
That's such a beautiful point to end on. Dr. Antreas Anthimou, thank you so very much for your time. An amazing piece of research. And hey, winging its way to publication shortly, one hopes. Thank you so very, very much.
Yeah, pleasure, Cora. Honestly, again, and even outside of the remit of this call, like I really, really enjoyed this.
It was wonderful to get to spend time with Dr. Anthimu. Thanks so very, very much for his time, as generously given as it always is, and as wonderful as it always is to get to spend time with him. I'm so glad that you get the opportunity to spend some time with him too. Hey, if you're interested in Antreas's research, you will find it on the Educational Psychology Research blog in due course, and hopefully in the published sphere as we begin the process of trying to get that work published. It's already found its way to the international stage in Riga, and we hope now that it will find its way to the international stage in the published literature too. But this is our new format, an opportunity not only for me to continue to review the scientific literature to be able to answer difficult questions about gender diversity, but also an opportunity for us to hear from and see in the video version of this, which you're welcome to find on YouTube. You'll find us reviewing the scientific literature in person with actual lived experience experts and experts in the field talking about their experience and about their research to help us to understand and answer challenging questions about the field. And of course, here we have the legendary Antreas telling us in no uncertain terms that it is possible to bring people together, even with diverse and, quite controversial views. We can bring people together and truly have difficult conversations, but ultimately work to create a world where everyone can find a place to belong. Thanks so very much for joining me. This is Classroom Psychology. You are very, very welcome here as always. And I look forward to seeing you as always in the next one.